Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to extend a welcome this morning. As you know, we're just coming in from Father John Vaughn's funeral in Santa Barbara, California. It was a great honor to see his picture up there in Meg's presentation. On behalf of the board of the Academy, I would simply like to repeat what Brother Brian said this morning. We're so pleased that you can participate in this conference, continuing the enthusiasm, the interest, even sometimes the controversy, which has surrounded the canonization of our Franciscan leader and newly canonized saint, Junípero Serra, the founder of my province. I live in a California mission San Luis Rey, and I'm delighted that we are now speaking about not only the period of Serra and the early missionaries, but bringing this into our contemporary context with today's, and especially this afternoon's presentation. I would like to introduce now our next speaker, rescheduled from this morning, Father Michael Perry, Minister General of the Order of Friars Minor. Father Mike is a member of the province of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and comes to us originally from Indiana. I think he would now consider himself certainly global and maybe global, Meg. His previous experience that Meg explained so eloquently, and I think spared him a good deal of embarrassment, brought him to Africa, and not only to Africa in a very difficult time in Congo, but also later brought him to the Catholic Relief Services, to the African Concerns at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops here in Washington, opening up, I think, a global perspective that he has certainly brought to his service as Vicar General and now Minister General of the Order. It is my very great pleasure to present our Minister General and my today's traveling companion, Father Michael Perry.
I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference. I'm really pleased that this dialogue on the experience and the challenges, concerns raised by the missionary practices of the friars in the New World, in the Americas, continues to draw interest, and I think continues to, in some ways, continues to instruct us, to give us directions, to give us orientations, to make suggestions, gentle reminders of past that we need not necessarily repeat, but which all too often we do. I also want to take, on behalf of the Order of Friars Minor, the General Definitorium, I want to take special offer a special word of gratitude to the American Academy of Franciscan History for the long excellence in research and writing, keeping alive the Franciscan intellectual tradition through its historical efforts. I remember at Quincy University laboring sometimes late at night with Michael Casado at one end of the basement and me at the other end, he listening to classical music and me listening to jazz, as each of us struggled through our work, and Michael, you remember that very well, 3 a.m. coffee breaks. I remember encountering the works of Franciscan Friar Maynard Geiger on the life and the times of Fray Junípero Serra. I read those works out of kind of a curious interest, because I really was much more interested in the Middle Ages at that time, the history Alexander of Hales and others, but I found it fascinating, the story that I encountered there. I realized that a lot of further work has been done, and perhaps some of the things that were recognized or suggested by Maynard need to be revised in a certain sense, but still I think his work offers us some special insights into the life of this great Franciscan missionary with all of his complexities. Secondly, I think I want to introduce myself. I'm not a specialist in the historical subject matter which is being dealt with here. I am a licensed missionary, 10 years of experience in Africa. I trained in anthropology, religious anthropology with a focus on mission theology. So most of my experience and insights come from another continent, come from the specific region of Central Africa from the Democratic Republic of Congo in particular. So you might be able to hear some of that as I try to share a few insights now. I think one of the most interesting elements in the missionary life of Brother Junípero Serra is his ownership of a growing sense of a desire to spread the message of the goodness of the Lord to all peoples, especially those beyond his own geographical frontiers. Obviously, there's much more work to be done to try to understand the nature of his own spiritual journey that led him from success and fame to the insecurity and sense of new beginnings that accompany anyone who embarks upon the cross-cultural, cross-geographical, intracultural boundaries involved in what traditionally has been termed mission agendas. What is most important is the notion of mission as a vocation that one receives. It's not something one creates, it's someone one believes that one has received. And I think this certainly was true in the case of the witness of Brother Junípero, as he describes himself on the eve of his departure to the New World. Brother Junípero was shaped most probably by his early contact with the Franciscans and by the stories they shared about their famous exploitations in the New World. I'm sure those stories were circulating constantly. We talked earlier about Raymond Lull and the impact that Lull would have had in Mallorca and in parts of Spain, not throughout, probably even throughout all of Spain, Portugal for that matter, at that time, given the particular relationship of Spain and Portugal. One understands the historical experience there. Undoubtedly, he heard stories about forsaken lands to where Franciscan missionaries were being sent, their heroic exploits and the winning of souls for God and for the church, and the transformation brought about in the lives of those among whom the friars were sent to evangelize, whether exaggerated or not. This later element is perhaps quite relevant to Brother Junípero's own approach to missionary evangelization, namely that the Franciscan missionary endeavor involved a going among. That seems to be a term that emerges from some of his letters. Those who did not know Christ and who were thus doomed to eternal damnation unless they received the message, were baptized and entered into the community of the redeemed. I will leave for those of you present who are specialists on the life and the work of Michael Joseph Serra to continue to delve into the Catholic Franciscan world of Mallorca in the 18th century. I think there's much more work to be done in that area as well to try to understand what I would call indigenous spiritual forms. What was the nature of the spiritual imagination of the people that inspired so many people, so many young men to undertake the journey to join Franciscan or other religious orders and congregations and to leave their lands to go elsewhere? I think this is something which I think would be quite fascinating. And obviously, in and of itself, it's not just, shouldn't be just meshed into this whole thing called the Catholic or the Christian tradition. Something very specific to Mallorca needs to be examined, I think. What were the drivers that created the type of imagination that sparked Junípero and other companions to go, Juan in particular, to embark upon this journey? There are, I would like to suggest, three elements of the missionary endeavor that are perceived in the life and work of Brother Junípero that I would like to explore a little bit more deeply to give some answer to possible lessons learned since the time of the Spanish and Mallorcan missionary activities in the New World over the course of nearly 4 centuries. These three elements include, number one, what exactly is the nature of missionary evangelizing activity from a biblical and ecclesial perspective? What was it and what is it? Number two, how is missionary evangelization to be conducted? What are the key elements in the praxis of the conduct of the church's missionary activities? And three, something which I think that Junípero himself would probably laugh at and enjoy, what are the new horizons for missionary evangelization to which the church, the Franciscan order, indeed all Catholics and Christians must give answer today? With these three questions in mind, I'd like to proceed in earnest humility. Number one, the nature of evangelizing activity, from perfect society to pilgrim people on a journey. Obviously, we know that the church's understanding of itself and of the missionary activities that it conducted were a response to changing awarenesses of its role in the world. For a very long time, beginning from the time of Cyprian of Carthage, the Catholic Church's understanding of the nature of the offer of salvation from God to human beings progressively came to be understood as the conversion of Christ to Christ in baptism and the entry into the church ordained by Christ. This doctrine was further developed during the Council of Florence in 1442, where Pope Eugene IV in the bull Cantate Domino states, the Most Holy Roman Catholic Church firmly believes, professes, and preaches that none of those existing outside the Catholic Church, not only pagans, also Jews, heretics, and schismatics, can ever be partakers of eternal life, but that they are going into eternal fire. I'll stop there. The quote continues with some other bloody references, but we'll leave it there. You get the picture anyway. Notwithstanding, I think that we need to keep this in mind because this certainly played into the religious imagination and in the driver for why people left to go become missionaries and go to the New World. Notwithstanding the theological distinctions made by St. Thomas of Aquinas, who spoke of being in the church in voto, in desire, or rather in se, in reality, those prepared to engage in the missionary activity of the church were given the mandate of converting all peoples to the true Catholic faith. We know this from the writings of many missionaries. This necessarily implied the proclamation of the gospel and the teaching of the church, Catholic catechism following the Council of Trent, the necessity of coming to faith in Jesus Christ through the sacraments of baptism into the church, and living a lifelong commitment to the faith. This is also another element that we see in the experience of missionary practice of Junípero and others. Those who have studied his work, and indeed most of the early Spanish and Majorcan missionaries to the Americas, will recognize this language and its impact on the conduct of missionary activities. The physical abuses of the indigenous peoples by Serra and his companions in mission were, as has been explained by Rosemarie Beebe and Robert Sienkiewicz in their recent publication, which we see here. It's only $14.99. I mean, no, it's special sale today. These must be placed within the religious and doctrinal view of the church espoused by Serra and his companions. Justification is not what is at stake here because his practices can never be justified. We have to admit that. What we are seeking, rather, is to bring light upon the religious motivations behind these practices. On the one hand, later and for another discussion, we need to look at the consequences of those upon the very people to whom these missionaries went. I don't think yet that's another story that's not yet to be developed. Again, I leave this for future scholars, the likes of which are present here. In the intervening years or centuries, further reflection was given to the church's understanding of the gift of faith and the necessity of explicitly professing that faith through baptism and the joining of the church. Time does not permit a full discussion of the developments that occurred over several centuries, certainly in the lead up to the time prior to the Second Vatican Council, with new understandings of the nature of the church, her identity, internal life, and mission in the world, her witness to the world, were formulated and developed and underwent, I would say, a radical reformulation. In an article written by a German Jesuit theologian entitled The Spirituality of the Church of the Future, Karl Rahner suggests this: what we now see is the poor church of sinners, no longer the church of power, the tent of the pilgrim people of God, pitched in the desert and shaken by the storms of history. The church laboriously seeking its way into the future, groping and suffering many internal afflictions, striving over and over again to make sure of its faith. We are aware of a church of internal tensions and conflicts. We feel burdened in the church by both the reactionary callousness and the institutional factor by which the reckless modernism that threatens to squander the sacred heritage of faith and destroy the memory of its historical experience. This is the church that we are called to love, and this church we are called to become mystics. I'll end there with the quote. There's more to say on that. I think what we recognize, this same idea is echoed more recently in a small document on what I would call the new manual on missionary evangelization by Pope Francis, where he talks about the church being called to get dirty and not to be the church that controls everything, but a church that's willing to become powerless for the sake of the one who is its authentic power. The Second Vatican Council opened its dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, by declaring the church's ancient faith that Jesus Christ is the light of God's mercy and love to the nations. This is not new for anyone who studied mission history. It's only within the light of this faith that we as church discern at one and the same time our identity and our vocation. This is a change, to be a sacrament of the communion of God with all people, to have with him by sharing in the very life of his Son, to be a sacrament of the communion of God. Those few words suggest, perhaps, a very different approach and understanding of the practice of mission in the church as we move forward. Another statement, Christ, having been lifted up on the earth, has drawn all to himself. Rising from the dead, he sent his life-giving Spirit upon his disciples, and through him he established his body, which is the church, as the universal sacrament of salvation. The Father is continually active in the world that he might lead people to the church and through it to join to himself, that he might make them partakers of his glorious life. As one might well imagine, with the change that has come in the church's own thinking about her nature, there immediately follows changes in the conduct of the church's witness to the world through its life example and also through the explicit proclamation of the gospel, the missionary activity of the church. What emerges from what comes out of the emerging ecclesiology of the church is a renewed understanding of the world, no longer viewed as a place of damnation and condemnation, but rather as a place where the Spirit of God is indwelling, present always and everywhere, even before the arrival of the evangelizers, as the Second Vatican Council, the document Ad Gentis, makes explicit, and as made explicit in subsequent documents. Furthermore, the Church's statement on her role in the modern world, the document of the Second Vatican Council entitled Gaudium et Spes, the Church explicitly recognizes the action of the Spirit in the world, serving as a preparation for the preaching of the gospel. Stephen Bevins, missiologist and former professor at Catholic Theological Union, picks up on this understanding of the role of the Spirit of God and confirms the insight of St. John Paul II, where he speaks of the Spirit as the principal agent of mission. Quote, "The church is not so much sent as much as it has become part of God's embrace of the world, an embrace made flesh in Jesus, but accompanied already in the past, the present and the continuing presence of the Holy Spirit," end of quote. Just like to pause for just a moment. I've asked myself, what can we draw in terms of lessons learned in this somewhat truncated but short presentation? There's so much more that could be developed with regards to the changing understanding of the nature of the church and missionary activity in the world, and I'm sure that you heard that earlier today. What is perhaps more important for us to realize is the power of the church's self-understanding, the self-understanding of the church, the power of that over its actual conduct of mission. This might appear all too obvious, but I believe it bears some specific reflection. In the missionary practice of Brother Junípero and the Spanish and Majorcan Franciscan missionaries working in the New World, and more explicitly in Mexico and Alta California, the church's self-identity shaped every aspect of the conduct of Christian mission. As the church thinks, so do its missionaries. This might or might not always apply equally, since the church's thought on its own relationship with the Spanish crown was, in specific circumstances, revealed to be somewhat of a red herring, specifically for those who engaged in missionary practices. The letters of Brother Junípero and of other missionaries prior to, during, and after his time, with regard to the abuse of practices of the Spanish crown toward those peoples it had conquered and placed under its jurisdiction, revealed a faith that found itself confronting situations of injustice. Very interesting. I know this from reading the literature of Africa, particularly of Central Africa, and the resistant movements that came up during the time of the colonial domination. These were not political movements. These were primarily religious in nature, because people's understanding of God, what the Christian awareness brought to them, married with their own understandings, created them a new vision of who God is and how God acts, which was quite contrary to the way that the colonial powers were acting, and in some cases to the way the missionaries were conducting their missionary evangelization. The same faith that Brother Jennifer followed in his drawing near and progressively seeking to convert to the faith of the one true church also led him to defend the interests of the people of God who had come into the fold, the indigenous peoples who had come to taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Thus, as was true in the times of Brother Junípero, and that continues to be true in the contemporary practice of Christian mission, defense of the basic human rights and dignity of all baptized, and also those who are not baptized, is relevant to the preaching of the gospel. This must have been true. I don't know how else to explain this. Please, specialists, help me. Why did this become a bothering concern in the missionary practice and the life of Brother Junípero? Much more remains to be done on the relationship between faith and defense of dignity and fundamental freedom among those whom the Franciscan missionaries were sent and with whom they lived and worked. Is there something to the power of the gospel itself, or perhaps to the doctrines of the catechetical formation in the faith, the liturgical practices, the rituals, or sensing that you're a full member of the body of Christ, that could lead the very proponents of Christian conversion to undertake crusades promoting human dignity and fundamental human rights? Recent studies in the works of Bartolomé de las Casas, William Wilberforce, Robert Casamont, to name just a few, would suggest that the pursuit of Christian conversion cannot proceed unless the fundamental elements guaranteeing dignity are also present. This, I think, could be some lesson learned from the experience even of Brother Junípero. While some in the Church would prefer to dismiss the conclusions of the 1971 World Synod on Justice in the World, namely, that the doing of justice is constitutive and essential dimension of the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, this has once again reaffirmed by Pope Francis in his manifesto on the missionary activity of the Church in the world today, paragraphs 177 through 183. What these passages make clear is the absolute priority of going forth from ourselves toward our brothers and sisters as one of two great commandments which ground every moral norm and as the clearest sign for discerning spiritual growth in response to God's completely free gift. For this reason, the service of charity is also a constituent element of the Church's mission and an indispensable expression of her very being. End of quote, Pope Francis. I'd like to move to the second point, the conduct of missionary evangelization. Missionary evangelization, following the theological vision of the Church as developed during and after the Second Vatican Council, and unfortunately there's not time to discuss all of the elements of this, places the Church in a very different position in the world and in her stance before other great religions. At the same time, things have markedly changed since the times of Brother Junípero Serra and the Church that shared a special but not always friendly relationship with the state or colonial empire, as I've already alluded to. Under the Spanish crown, the Church enjoyed tremendous benefits and privileges. This continued also in practice in Africa. These did not come without a cost, as we have seen. The world in which we find ourselves today, the context for Christian mission, witnesses the relegation of religion to the margins of the New World Order. Religious functions within a very secular context, and this had tremendous consequences for the practice of mission. I'd like to draw out several of these and suggest that we might need to look at developing some new approaches in order for the Church to continue its witness of faith with the same conviction and hope that was held by Brother Junípero. The Church present in the 6 continents of the world speaks very differently about its role in society, demonstrating an increasing awareness of diversity, something not well appreciated by some in the Church. What emerges from an awareness that we are dealing with a world church united in love and communion under the authority of the Bishop of Rome is that the nature and methods of missionary evangelization cannot be equally applied in all contexts and to all peoples in the same manner. I dare say that careful analysis of the missionary history of the Church in the different geographical regions of the world would reveal greater diversity than previously known, even during the time of Brother Junípero and in the case of the New World, or in Africa or in Asia. I want to make that point very clear. What we sometimes have are kind of a standardization of texts, and what we are missing are the diversity of experiences that are not, those were screened out, if you will, probably in some cases because they were not accepted, they were not approved. And I think we need somehow to recover those. The one place where we can recover, I'll get to that in just a moment, I don't want to jump ahead. European Christianity, philosophy, economics, technology, and cultures, while transmitted by the European missionaries as they dispersed throughout the world, were not always communicated in the same manner by those who bore the gospel. What is even more interesting is the way by which those who received the gospels were not as passive as once believed. The work of Lamensane especially as developed in his 1989 groundbreaking work on the translation of the Christian scriptures, Translating the Message, argues that the role of those who transmitted the gospel became reluctant opponent. The role of those who transmitted the gospel became reluctant opponents of colonial domination that we sense in the writings of Brother Junípero. Sane also argues that those who received the gospel, and his reference point here is Africa, the indigenous converts played a much more active role than previously presented. In more recent times, Christianity has had to come to terms with the phenomena of the privatization of faith in relation to the public square. John Adams, in speaking about the role of religion in public life in the U.S., once remarked that our Constitution made only for a moral and religious people, it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. How things have changed. Today, American public, political, and legal opinion seems increasingly to understand our Constitution as having been made precisely to protect people from any mode of governance that will reflect their own moral and religious beliefs, precisely as moral and religious beliefs. Whereas the secular public square, if Adams was stripped of any particular form of confessionalism, open to people of all confessions, today this same square is being purposely stripped of confession itself, of any belief that might be said to transcend the text of our Constitution, however interpreted, and the sovereign will of the people. This phenomenon is not only occurring in the U.S., in a sense one may say that our nation is only catching up with those other societies that have always affirmed such a strict wall of separation between the claims of the church or synagogue or mosque or temple and the claims of the state. Whereas the state's claims are so obviously public, touching upon the lives of all the citizens, the claims of religion must be seen as strictly private in nature and touching only upon the conscience of the individual believer and his or her like-minded communicants. This is certainly different than in the times of Brother Junípero, where the interests of state and those of church were closely bound, benefiting both the conversion of souls and the extension of colonial power to all segments of society. The consequences for this are yet to be fully analyzed or understood. One obvious consequence of this socio-political shift has been the need for us to develop ways of speaking about the significance of our most deeply held convictions for the common good that are capable of gaining a hearing in the public square. Another consequence is the more fundamental need for us to justify even our presence in the public square. Gone are the days when the church could claim the right to engage in the public square on the assertions that it is an expert in humanity or by some divine right. In light of recent scandals and other difficulties, our presence in the public square has even been further relegated. Another implication for Christian mission is the increasing awareness of the centrality of dialogue. A church at the margins no longer controls discourse, religious nor in any other form. It is obliged to enter into dialogue with others. While this might appear as a consequence of the changes taking place in the larger society, it also provides new opportunities for us to enter deeply into the lived experience of the other, something that appears as a desire and a strategy in the life of Brother Junípero. Dialogue does not exclude proclamation, as the 1991 document, Dialogue and Proclamation, makes clear. And there's a quote, I'm going to skip that. Dialogue from a theological perspective is a continuation of the very act of who God is. God in Trinity, God in three persons, however we want to frame that. We have a God who speaks, who communicates, who talks. Thus, to enter into dialogue understood in its various dimensions is to participate in the ongoing dialogue of God in Jesus and the Spirit. Intercultural dialogue is a further expression of this fundamental dialogue, theological dialogue, one that leads to renewed commitment to something that seems to have been either named as a taboo or simply too dreadful to try to take a task. That term I'm talking about is enculturation. We know that enculturation is one of the thorniest issues facing the life of the church and its practice of mission today. But this was also true in the time of Junípero Serra, and we know this already from the earlier and the experience in Asia of the question of the rights, in Africa of the question of ancestors. This has been repeated over and over again, the mistakes And that's why I say it's very important for us to listen to history and the role that you play in helping to identify history as close as we can get to the experience of what actually took place. We know that in the time of Junípero Serra, especially his combination of the barbaric and heathen acts, moral or spiritual, that were attributed to the indigenous peoples, most of this occurred probably mostly out of incapacity to understand the linguistic barriers that you referred to earlier today. Jeff, I think that's something that appears obviously clear in the works here. I think this is yet a further demonstration of the urgency of the church and of all mission agencies to embark upon a serious, sustained, and open conversation with the very cultures and peoples among whom Christian faith is being shared. Failure to deepen dialogue at this level risks leading the church and its missionary disciples simply to repeat the same mistakes committed by Brother Junípero and his contemporary Franciscan brothers, and indeed all others who were involved in the missionary enterprise. Speaking of all others who were involved in the missionary enterprise, we arrive at one further area that requires additional examination, something perhaps we could call a lesson to be learned. In his work on the missionary mandate of the church, to which I've already alluded, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis, those entrusted with the missionary evangelization work of the church can no longer be limited to trained specialists, priests, and religious who have enjoyed a privileged position in the history of missionary evangelization. I say this not in any way to undermine or cut short the tremendous work that has sometimes been done. And I emphasize sometimes been done, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose. However, the church already since Argentis in Evangelii Nuntiandis and Missio Redemptoris has recognized increasingly the important role of lay missionaries in the proclamation of the gospel. Pope Francis has carried to logical conclusion the consequences of Christian baptism and entry into full discipleship with the Lord Jesus. This marks a major shift in the theology and practice of Catholic mission. While it cannot be denied that the Catholic laity have played a determinant role in the preaching of the gospel, most especially through their witness of life example, the Church now recognizes that each and every baptized member is not only a participant in mission, but is mission by the very nature of their entry into the body of Christ. What would the missions of the Americas have looked like had this understanding of mission been present and communicated during the time of the Spanish missionary endeavors in the Americas, or in Africa, or in Asia for that matter? And let us not forget to speak about new evangelization, the needs of the church in Europe today. So we're not just talking about the otherness of the Americas, we now have to speak about the otherness of everywhere and the need for the ongoing proclamation of the gospel. One further consequence of a changed and renewed understanding of the missionary nature of the church and its practices in the life of the church and world today is that of the role of the traditionally mission-receiving peoples or nations and their relationship to the historically defined mission-sending communities or churches. We no longer live in a one-way age. All activity is two, three, or even four-way. What would the church among the native populations evangelized by Brother Junípero and his companions have looked like if the peoples they evangelized would have been invited into the very act of evangelizing? What would have been the implications for catechetical practices and also for liturgical and other expressions? We will never know the answers to these questions. What we do know is that we live in very different changed times. What is critical is that we find a new language with which to engage with the new evangelizers, those from former peripheries, so that together we might devise new awarenesses and strategies that might help future generations of agents of missionary evangelization to not simply repeat the past. Unfortunately, there are too many examples of this in all the various local churches, something Pope Francis is most aware of, and again alludes to in Evangelii Gaudium. The third area that I'd like to, and the final area I'd like to draw some attention to briefly is what I would call new horizons for missionary evangelization. And I would put two words with that: grace and powerlessness, and the gift of fraternity. With the rise of the digital age, an entirely new world is opened, one much vaster than the oceans navigated by the frigates that transported Brother Junípero to the shores of the New World. The birth of digital natives creates entirely new spheres of language, culture, and technology barriers with which we must engage if we are to carry forth in fidelity the call to invite others to taste and see the goodness of the Lord. And as much in the times of Brother Junípero, we will need to create new training programs for missionaries, indeed for all baptized Christians, if we are to take seriously the call of Pope Francis and indeed the Gospels and the earliest experiences of the nascent Christian communities, the times of St. Paul and others. Another urgent horizon today is what the Church in Africa has defined the need to see, perceive, and frame evangelization as reconciliation. The Church in Africa speaks of evangelization in these terms. The end of the Second Special Synod, it said the new name for evangelization is reconciliation. I think many of us know the work of Robert Schreider from Catholic Theological Union in this area. This, I think, is also something that could be a lesson learned because of if anything, some of the protests that were raised around the canonization, the whole process in the last 30 years, have been raised because of the lack of reconciliation. We're talking about wounds that have never been touched or healed. And this is something which, whatever new language of mission evangelization we talk about, we have to develop a new language that will touch this area, that will touch and heal, bring healing and reconciliation, historical, spiritual, social, and others. This cannot be understated as daily we witness the slaughter of humanity by humanity, and what some have talked about, the re-tribalization of the world by hate mongers, whether they're politicians or others. I'll leave it to your imagination to put names. This certainly played a role in the life. These are not, this tribalization, this lack of reconciliation, certainly played a role in the time of Junípero Serra. He was a member of a tribe, and he found himself among members of other tribes, and how he could not really fathom and negotiate how to negotiate the bridge. He tried, made attempts, we know that, but he could not fully navigate and create the bridges that needed to be constructed in order for what, on the one hand, could be called an authentic transmission of the gospel. On another, it would just simply be the respect of human beings and of their specialness, their uniqueness. I think a third area that I've already made, the grace of powerlessness. I think Pope Francis had made this a central element, a component of what he has defined as the new approach to mission. He talks about a church that is poor among the poor. He's not just talking here about I don't think, an economic situation. He's talking about an entirely new attitude of how to live and to go forth with the gospel in the world. Certainly, this would have been, I think, something, again, from lessons learned. What would the Spanish Mallorcan, I mentioned Spanish and Mallorcan because I was here 1 year ago when a priest from Mallorca got into a fight with the bishop during Mass. And I don't want to repeat that in case somebody's recording this and saying, we want to recognize the full complexity of, again, this even suggests the tribes. There were tribes within the Franciscan world, within the Spanish world, that had tremendous, because, I think, in part because they were living under the belief, the superstition of power, instead of the grace of powerlessness. The new missionary call for us is to learn to this grace of powerlessness. How do we live in a world where we do no longer need to control? Because the very nature of what we proclaim says that God is in control. If that's true, what does that do? How does that shape the relationships and the way we care and respect for people, whether or not they are converted to a message that we share, just by the very fact that we live in a common home, that we share common interests together. This has tremendous implications on what would also, this whole question of dialogue of civilizations, dialogue of cultures, that has become increasingly important in the world today. I think another fourth area I'd like to underline is what I would call the gift of fraternity. It's very interesting, just reading. I tried to read in preparation a little bit. I took this one evening, and no, actually a number of evenings, read the letters. I was more interested in reading the letters than I was the commentary. I really probably need to go back and read the commentary so I understand fully what's in the letters. But in any case, that's to give credit to the two writers. But I think the letters themselves were extremely revealing. The tender relationship, and I use the word tender relationship, the caring relationship that existed between Junípero and Juan, there's something about, this is something defines the nature of Christian mission. It's not individuals who go forth. It's communities who go forth. It's fraternities who go forth. And this is a lesson learned for us Franciscans today. One of the greatest challenges is for us to redefine Christian mission no longer as lone rangers who ride out into the sunset, conquer the world, build kingdoms, and come back and give reports every 3 years or so on all the wonders we've been able to do, because then we would have books like this as well written about us. But I think what we need to somehow rediscover what was one of the originating gifts of St. Francis to the world, his understanding of fraternitas, of fraternity, not only as a way of conceiving of how God embraces the world, but how we are to embrace the world and how we are to carry forth what is called the missionary evangelization entrusted to us, this mission, fraternities as mission or in mission. I think Junípero, Serra, Juan, I think somehow, no matter what else can be said, somehow they understood that the missionary enterprise was not a Lone Ranger enterprise. This came later. This came in the, we know this came in the, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, and continues until today. And is a struggle for the church, a struggle for the Franciscans, a struggle for many of, and not only for us, even laity now involved sometimes become Lone Rangers and castle builders. So I think that this question of the gift of fraternity is something which needs to explore, because one of the things that certainly the world is looking for is fraternitas, is a sense of being members, belonging, sharing together, and experiencing humanity together. Finally, I think the ultimate frontier, but there are about 300,000 more of them, or 60 billion, was it 600 billion now, galaxies or something anyway. The ultimate frontier, I think, is the ongoing conversion of those who have tasted and seen, of those who themselves have experienced transformation, and perhaps in a call to give witness to the resurrection, to the saving power of the gospel. I think this is something which I perceive in the letters that I read from Junípero Serra. In the struggles that went on in his life, I perceived that he understood the ongoing need for conversion in his life. Conversion in multiples of forms, most of which I've tried to explain above. And I think this conversion is tied up with the frontier of hope. Conversion is a means for us to reach that place that's been prepared from the beginning of time by the Father in the Son and the Spirit, that place of hope, that place of a new humanity that St. Paul speaks of. I share with you, these are a few reflections that I wanted to share with you in attempting to reflect a little bit on the life of Junípero Serra, on the place of the order in the church today. Thank you for your kind attention.